Director, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Stewart Center. And we also have Robert Hamilton, Head of the Eurasia Research, Foreign Policy Research Institute, both joining us by video conference. Welcome, gentlemen. If you would, we'll have Mr. Bergman open with a 5-minute statement, and then we'll go to Mr. Hamilton. Thank you for making yourselves available. So with that, Mr. Bergman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a real honor and privilege to be speaking to the Parliamentary Committee today on what is, I think, an incredibly important topic. I was going to focus my introductory remarks on the threat posed by Russia in the period ahead, because I think we need to be very clear-eyed that no matter how events in Ukraine play out, that as long as Vladimir Putin remains president of Russia, he will be a determined adversary of Canada and of the United States and of Europe. Vladimir Putin, I think, is very much driven by seeing the United States in particular as Russia's main adversary, as the main obstacle to Russia's geopolitical greatness. And he is consumed by Russia achieving a grand geopolitical stature. While we looked at events in Syria with great awe over the last month as sort of a defeat of Russia's efforts in the region, I think we have to go back roughly 10 years to when Russia intervened in Syria. I was then at the U.S. Department of State, and we were all shocked that here was Russia intervening in a country inside of a civil war in a region where it is not in. It was in the Middle East. Russia had previously, for the past 25 years, focused on its near abroad, and here Russia was in the Middle East. And it made Russia a significant player in the region, had helped it build its ties with Gulf states, with Israel. And the purpose of this intervention, I think, largely was about Russia's ability to act on the global stage, and represented, I think, Russia for the first time since the end of the Cold War, kind of returning to its great power stature that it had during the Soviet period. And while this past month has been a grand defeat for Russia's grand strategy, it is not going to sort of lay down lightly and will continue. And I think what we have to remember, just looking at Russia's military, is that Russia's army has been significantly ground down by the war in Ukraine. It is suffering tremendous casualties, more than 500,000. Its ground materiel have been significantly depleted. Yet Russia has built up a tremendous defense industrial base, has invested significantly with the help of China and with others, and with its vast smuggling networks. And so Russia's production capacity is going to be sustained whether this war ends in 2025 or not. And that will mean, I think, a relatively fast effort to recapitalize its ground forces. But then when we turn to the other aspects of the Russian military, the Russian Navy, the Russian Air Force, Russian space capabilities have been far less impacted by this war. And what we have also seen is Russia really significantly strengthen its military relationships with not just North Korea and Iran, but also China. And this has meant, and maybe as a final comment, that China is playing an increasing role in the Arctic. I think this is not something that should cause short-term concern. In many respects, this is driven by China simply looking at the fact that the climate is changing, and that this is potentially a new significant global trading route, and so therefore it's only natural for China to scope it out militarily. However, I do think that this portends down the road, over the long term, a growing Chinese presence in the Arctic. While this may make some Russians uncomfortable, that I think has been sort of the price of Chinese support for Russia. And maybe as a final comment, I also think that Russia's past history as being, in fact, a rather important actor when it comes to nuclear nonproliferation has been completely reversed by this war. Russia had been a key part of the Iranian nuclear negotiations, sanctions toward North Korea. But Russia has reversed that because of the short-term focus on the events in Ukraine, and I don't see it returning. So Russia's willingness to provide missile components, other technology to actors like Iran, to actors like North Korea, and perhaps others around the world, I think it should be of significant concern to Canada, to the United States, and into many in Europe. And maybe I'll close it there.
Mr. Bergman, nicely within 5 minutes, too. Appreciate it. Mr. Hamilton, 5 minutes, please. You're on mute, Mr. Hamilton. It's the curse of the 21st century.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear. As Mr. Bergman said, it's an honor and a pleasure to be before the committee. So I'll start by saying Russia poses the only existential threat to the United States and its NATO allies, including Canada, due to its nuclear arsenal. But that's a threat that's highly unlikely to materialize under current conditions. I would argue that a more likely and still profoundly dangerous threat is a combined Chinese-Russian military confrontation with the West. Also not necessarily likely under current conditions, but something that's much more conceivable than a Russian strategic nuclear attack on the U.S. and its NATO allies. Russia is an acute militarized threat to the entire Euro-Atlantic area. It's an acute militarized threat to the U.S., Canada, and all of our NATO allies. China is the only state, as the U.S. national security strategy says, with both the will and the capability to rewrite the rules of international order. So to be blunt, it's a vital national interest of the U.S., I think Canada and all of its NATO allies, not to have to fight a war against China and Russia at the same time. The question then becomes how to avoid this outcome. The most serious, currently active threat to North American security, I would argue, is the war in Ukraine. If Russia wins in Ukraine, I'll sort of paraphrase the words of one of what I consider to be our best Russian military analyst, Dara Masakot of the RAND Corporation, who says if Russia wins in Ukraine, it will be bruised, vengeful, and overconfident, believing it has bested the West. Because to be clear, Russia is fighting in Ukraine, but it's fighting against, it believes it's fighting against NATO and the Europe and North America. Every time Putin has believed he has bested the West, in 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Ukraine, 2015 in Syria, he has launched a larger and more ambitious war in the wake of that war. And so I think it is a important, if not vital, national interest of NATO states that Russia not win in Ukraine. And also, what happens in Ukraine is going to affect China, and it's going to affect the Indo-Pacific region, because both China and our partners and allies in that region are watching the outcome of the war in Ukraine to learn things about Western tolerance for risk, Western support of Ukraine, Western support of partners and allies in other regions. On the other hand, I think lumping China and Russia together as a singular threat, as you'll sometimes see Western policymakers do, I think that is not in our interest for a couple of reasons. One, it obscures the major difference between them. Yes, China is trying to rewrite or remake the rules of international order. Russia, I would argue, is trying to burn the international order down using military power, where China, to this point, is primarily using diplomatic and economic tools. The other thing about lumping them together as a singular threat is it drives them together. The United States has been called the binding agent in that relationship. And it's not, I think it's not for nothing that if we look where China and Russia are most in partnership, it's areas where the U.S. and in some cases its other partners and allies have the largest footprint, especially military footprint. So I think the best way to avoid the outcome of a combined Chinese military challenge or confrontation to the West is to think hard about policies and actions and drive them together. And that means think hard about where we deploy military power. Places like Europe and the Indo-Pacific are non-negotiable because we have binding treaty commitments to allies and partners there. But it's no coincidence that where our footprint is the lightest, places like Africa and Central Asia, cooperation between China and Russia is also the lightest. And in some places like Central Asia, competition is emerging. So I would, I'm at 4 minutes now. I'll sum up by saying another threat we need to look at that's not sort of in the military domain, but is more in the informational domain, is we need to strengthen our democratic and societal resilience throughout the West. Russian election interference is something that's been going on for a long time. Very recent examples we can talk in the Q&A in Moldova and Romania. disinformation. We need to strengthen critical thinking skills and consider ways to prevent Russia's use of our open societies against us. Finally, on China and information, China long used the information instrument to build a positive image of China, but it's now more using Russian methods, which is to discredit the idea of objective truth altogether and to discredit our own governments in the eyes of our people. And I'll stop there.
I hope our colleagues are as disciplined as the two of you are in terms of time management. Ms. Gallant, first up, 6 minutes.
Okay, so to Mr. Hamilton, how does the fall of the Bashar regime shift the paradigms in the Russia, China, Ukraine, European realms?
So, as I said in a recent interview with Forbes Ukraine, Russia's defeat anywhere is good for the world. And so what has happened recently in Syria, I believe, is a defeat for Russia. How it shifts, I don't think it has much, and I'd be interested to hear what Mr. Bergman thinks. I don't think it has a significant impact on Russia's war effort in Ukraine for a few reasons. One, Russian assets in Syria were fairly light. The number of ground forces was very small. It was never more than several thousand. I think it's much less at this time, mostly advisors and special forces. The air and naval assets that Russia had at Hmeimim Air Base in Latakia province and in Tartus, it only had a handful of ships. Those have now been moved somewhere around 8 to 12 kilometers offshore in the Eastern Mediterranean, awaiting developments. I don't think if Russia were to reprogram assets from Syria into Ukraine, it would have a significant difference. In terms of Russia's relationship with China, I also don't think it has a direct effect. It is a defeat. It is I would argue, not necessarily a strategic defeat for Russia, but it's a defeat of a regime that Russia had propped up for 9 years. And wanted to see win. And so I would argue that actually the war in Ukraine and Russia's demonstrated military incapacity, at least in some areas, has had a more direct effect on China's perception of Russia than what has happened in Syria.
The huge buildup over and around Taiwan this week by China. Would you say that, or would you reassess the 5-year projected ability for China to invade Taiwan to have changed, or are we underestimating that timeline? Or was this just another one of Xi's hissy fits over the new president going over to the U.S.?
It's a great question. I will preface this by saying I do not consider myself a China expert. I wrote a book on China-Russia relations and have done research over the past couple of years on that. But I do consider myself more of a Russia specialist. So the 2027 timeline we keep hearing about that Xi Jinping has given the People's Liberation Army is the date by which he wants the PLA to have the military capability to liberate Taiwan, to invade and occupy Taiwan by force. I don't necessarily think that means that the clock is ticking in 2027, it runs out. I do think it runs out that Xi Jinping sees himself in the same way Putin does as a historical figure, as an epochal figure, and therefore, by the end of Xi Jinping's tenure, I think his goal, and I think for him it's non-negotiable, is to have Taiwan reintegrated. Okay. How that happens diplomatically, economically, or militarily, I can't say.
Okay, so you were in Montreal, and you witnessed the full court press of Ukrainian representatives pleading for an invitation to join NATO, recognizing that that would not be immediate. There are many standards that have to be met, but that was the best way to stand up to Putin. If that were to happen, and I know that there isn't consensus yet, how would, or what would the impact be in Ukraine? Would that change Putin's aggression, or would it stop the increased aggressions, the escalation?
Yeah, my sense is that however the Ukraine war ends, and I think that unfortunately it's likely to end with Russian troops still occupying some portion of Ukrainian territory. But however it ends, the only way to prevent, and I listened into the first session, and this was also a theme, my sense is the only way to prevent Russia from restarting that war as soon as it's rebuilt its military capability, to what it considers the required level is for Ukraine to have legally enforceable security guarantees, whether it's NATO membership or some consortium of countries, probably almost all NATO members, who give Ukraine legal binding security guarantees and say, if you are invaded again by the Russians, we will fight. Then the question becomes, how do you deter that invasion? Is a legal document, whether it's NATO's Article 5 or some other legal document, adequate, or do there have to be forces on the ground? Does there have to be a deterrent force from non-Ukrainian militaries present in Ukraine? I think the latter is far more likely to deter renewed aggression than binding security guarantees. But it also comes at much higher risk because, and then immediately, as we already have in 8 of frontline NATO states now where there are battle groups present, and immediately a Russian invasion of any of those countries or Ukraine, if there are forces on the ground, would put Western military forces in a state of war with the Russian Federation.
Okay, so do you have any information on these reports that we're hearing of drones being dispatched from the Atlantic, over the Atlantic Ocean to New Jersey? Any clarity on that? What's going on there?
Not from me. My knowledge of that is CNN deep. I keep hearing it's an Iranian mothership, and the U.S. Department of Defense has said no, there's not. But again, I'm not an expert witness on that topic.
Ms. Lambropoulos, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here to answer some of our questions today. I'm going to start with Mr. Hamilton. You spoke about the best way to avoid a China-Russia confrontation against the West. You said that would be like the biggest threat that we should be worried about, and that while it's not super likely in the near future, there are things that we can do in order to limit the possibilities. So can you be a little bit more specific? You said, we can watch where we're putting our resources, our army. Can you be a little bit more specific and give us some more ideas of how we can ensure that this type of relationship or this type of collaboration doesn't happen in the future?
Sure. And I'll say that so the narrative about the China-Russia relationship is whether it is a strategic partnership or an axis of convenience. And those are sort of nice academic sort of ideal types that help frame the debate. I think neither of them is accurate. I think the relationship is dynamic, complex, and contingent. It's dynamic because it responds to things that happen in the world. What happened in Syria recently is one of those. It's complex because they interact across what we call the instruments of power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And it's contingent because these are great powers that have presence all over the world, and it can be affected by things that happen on the ground that might be out of the control of neither of the capitals in Beijing and Moscow. So, as I said, our commitments to our NATO allies and the countries with which we, in this case, I mean the U.S., have binding security commitments to in the Indo-Pacific are non-negotiable. They're legal commitments. And therefore, there's a requirement to deploy military force there to deter conflict or to prevail in conflict if deterrence fails. Other parts of the world, Africa and Central Asia, I mentioned as examples. I looked at China for this book project. I looked at Chinese-Russian interaction in Africa and Central Asia, places where the U.S. military footprint is lighter than in Europe and the Indo-Pacific are places where Chinese-Russian interaction tends to be either compartmentalized, as I would call it, in Africa, where each is doing its own thing, is vaguely aware of what the other is doing, but they're not cooperating or coordinating, or in Central Asia, increasingly they're competitors, especially in the economic sphere. So my sort of admonition to Western policymakers, and this applies to U.S. policymakers especially because I hear this from them a lot, is we should try to drive a wedge between China and Russia. My advice is do not try to do that. Think about where we deploy military power, be judicious in where we deploy military power, ensure that we only deploy military power where vital or core national interests are at stake. And in places like Central Asia, I think our strategy is fairly correct. We talk about things like sovereignty, democratic resilience or civil society development, regional cooperation, economic development. Those are things where Western partners can make a contribution in Central Asia. It doesn't trigger fears of Russia and China of some sort of Western military presence or intervention. And it probably does allow conditions for Chinese-Russian competition to emerge, whereas otherwise it wouldn't, especially if we were there in some sort of military sense.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. You also spoke about strengthening the resilience in the West against misinformation, disinformation, against perhaps Russia and China's attempts to destabilize the West. And so I'm going to ask you about some examples you can give that have already occurred in Canada, for example, or in the West, where they have been successful at doing this, and things that we should be looking out for to take precaution, of these situations in the future.
Yeah, so I very briefly, because I was coming to the end of my time, I very briefly mentioned Moldova and Romania as the two most recent examples of sort of, this is Russian election interference, but it's also combined with information operations, propaganda, disinformation. In Moldova, the Russians tried indirectly through a Moldovan oligarch who's resident in Russia to buy 300,000 votes against Maia Sandu's candidacy for president and against the referendum on EU accession or integration. In a country like Moldova, 300,000 votes is enough to swing an election, and they came very close. They were able to buy over 100,000 before the Moldovan security services understood what was happening and were able to shut this effort down. But that's one example. Another example in Romania, where Gheorghescu, this candidate who won the first round of the presidential election and literally came from nowhere, he was in 8th or 9th place among the candidates a month prior to the election. He had no organization. He had no funding. He had a TikTok presence that was was definitely amplified, according to the Romanian special services, intelligence services, was created and amplified by the Russians, out of the Russian Federation. What's interesting is it appears that TikTok was initially unaware and then tried to take measures to prevent this, but were unable to. So, of course, the question becomes, in the Romanian case, was this some sort of combined Chinese-Russian effort using TikTok to promote the candidacy of an anti-Europe, anti-NATO, pro-Russian candidate for the Romanian presidency? It doesn't appear it was. It does definitely appear there were Russian fingerprints all over this, but it does not appear that even TikTok, much less the Chinese government, was a part of this effort. So the Romanian Constitutional Court has now annulled the first round of the elections. It will be rerun. But again, these are two cases where Russia came very close to swinging the outcome of a democratic election using misinformation and interference.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there, Ms. Lamropoulos.
Thank you.
Monsieur Samar, 6 minutes. Mr. Samard will ask his questions en français.
Mr. Samar, you have...
As long as you're into the interpretation channel. Monsieur Samar.
Mr. Samar, 6 minutes. Thank you very much. We have the interpreter. Yes, you can hear me? Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. Both of you have addressed the support or collaboration of China with Russia. I would like to hear you in greater detail about the form that takes.
Maybe I can start. Well, I think right now the form that is taking that is most significant is that China is effectively blunting the impact of global tanctions against Russia. So sanctions have proven quite effective at making an economy, tanking an economy, causing economic pain and immiseration. And China is making that, is blunting that effort. For instance, the Russian car industry has effectively collapsed. but Russians now can buy very good Chinese cars instead. And that extends to the military and defense industrial production, as I mentioned. And then what is China getting in return? Well, China is getting, I think, a number of access to Russian military technology that's more advanced than what they have. Things like aircraft engines, perhaps missile defense, fighter designs, other, I think, technology related to kind of advanced systems. And then, as I mentioned, China is also seemingly getting more access in the Arctic and in other places. And maybe just a quick point is that I think we have oftentimes thought that we could wedge these two countries, Russia and China, because of the conflict that emerged during the Cold War, because of Nixon to China. But that had also stemmed from, after the death of Stalin, competition within the communist world over leadership and a 10-year rivalry between China and Russia. And what we've seen now is a more than 10-year effort by both Putin and Xi to build ties. And because both leaders really buy into this relationship, I think it's quite durable. And that's extending deep down into the bureaucracies militarily and economically.
And I would just add, of course, the question of China's support for Russia, I think, is most important in terms of the war in Ukraine. And I think what you're seeing is sort of diplomatically, China is mostly supporting Russia in that it is not. It's been described as free riding on Russian vetoes of UN Security Council resolutions on Ukraine, because the Chinese know the Russians are going to veto anything that calls for a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine or criticizes Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so they abstain. So it's sort of passive diplomatic support. Informationally, China's information operations are very closely echoing Russia's justification for the war in terms of NATO enlargement, indivisibility of security, and all these things. Militarily and economically, I would describe China's response as self-interested more than direct support of Russia. So we know that Russia has asked for direct military support. We believe that China has not provided it. I mean, that's the conclusion of all the Western intelligence services. China is exercising more with the Russian military, ground, sea, and air. And they're doing that because Russia is the only country on the planet right now fighting a Western trained and equipped adversary, and the Chinese are trying to learn from that because they think they may have to do something similar in the future. So it does provide sort of a little bit of legitimacy to the Russian military exercising with China, but China is also benefiting and learning from that. Economically, yes, China is providing dual-use items and items that allow the Russian economy to sustain itself in the face of sanctions. Frankly, so are many other countries on the planet, to include a lot of EU and North American countries. They're just doing it through intermediaries like Kyrgyzstan, until recently, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia. If you look at exports from the EU, for instance, several EU countries to Kyrgyzstan, they've gone up 2,000 to 4,000% over the last year. Well, we all know where that's going, right? It's going through Kyrgyzstan into Russia. So China is just doing the same thing, but directly. And then I would end by saying I think the Chinese-Russian economic relationship, is more and more approaching a colonial relationship where Russia exports raw materials to China, oil and gas, at a discount. So the Chinese are buying Russian oil and gas, yes, but at a deep discount. And then Russia's importing finished goods from China. So more and more, Russia's in a subordinate position economically.
Merci.
Thank you. So, that being known, should the United States decide to cut their support to Ukraine, what message would that send? Could it increase the pressure that China is putting on Taiwan? Could it, in one way or another, shift the strategic relationships between China and Russia?
In less than 30 seconds.
So should the United States stop providing military aid to Ukraine? And let's be clear, the Biden administration is going to spend down all its military aid budget by the end of its term, which means that in order for there to be additional aid, President Trump will have to request that military aid, and that may be unlikely. My sense is that Russia will then move to try to win the war and will not be very interested in negotiations. I don't really see China stepping up to increase its support. but I think what it will to Russia, but what I think it will do is cement the perception within Beijing that the West is not in anything for the long haul, and ergo, even if it were to get into trouble by trying to invade and occupy Taiwan, and if that were to be a slog like Russia has experienced in Ukraine, after many years, China would eventually prevail because the West would lose stomach for this fight, which sort of confirms old sort of communist sentiment about the weak kind of capitalist materialist West. So I think it would affirm that perception.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I apologize. Ms. Masson, 6 minutes.
I suppose I could pick it up from there, actually. My first question was going to be fairly similar in that now with Trump 2.0 coming onto the scene, we may see major differences, the consequences of how that may threaten that stability of world order. But certainly with the new Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, could you maybe just continue on what you were saying before you were cut off in terms of those differences? But the one thing that I had also asked in the previous panel wasn't necessarily, yes, there's a potential of withdrawal from the West or by the West, by the United States in this conflict, but what about the pure, more significant interference of determining how that peace will go down, or peace, and to the expense of the Ukrainians in terms of territory or what have you, and what that would look like?
Maybe I'll just start quickly. Just to extend what I was saying, look, I think when we look at negotiations between Russia and Ukraine with the United States pushing for them, the question we have to ask is what's in it for Vladimir Putin? Why would he agree to negotiations when he thinks right now that he's winning the war, that U.S. support may not be there over the long haul? And he just experienced what happens to the Ukrainian military if U.S. aid is suspended when we stopped providing aid between October 1st, 2023 and April when we finally passed the supplemental. And what happened was the Ukrainian military withered greatly, and Russia experienced great gains in which Ukraine is still trying to recover from militarily. So I think you'll look at the end of 2025 as a real opportunity where Ukraine will be significantly withered militarily. And yes, Russia has lost more than 500,000 people. But we know this here in the United States. The sunk cost fallacy really applies when you're in a long war where you may have lost a lot and you think, you want to get out, but on the other hand, you can see a light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that light at the end of the tunnel for Putin will have gotten brighter with the United States being less willing to support Ukraine over the long haul.
I agree completely, and I would just add that for trying to incentivize Ukraine into a negotiation now, I think is especially with the prospect of cutting off military assistance to Ukraine would be a grave error. And as Mr. Bergman said, first of all, the question is, what's Russia's incentive to negotiate? Now, there are many different flavors of a possible Trump strategy for Ukraine that have been floated. There was one by Mike Pompeo and David Urban last summer, neither of whom are going to be in the administration, so I'm not sure it has much purchase. But it was what I think a little more realistic strategy in that in an early phase, we would actually step up military support to Ukraine, lift some of the restrictions to increase the pain level on the Russians and incentivize them to come to the table in good faith. The problem, I think, with that and all the Trump versions, the versions of Trump strategies for Ukraine, is I think they're a little bit unrealistic or even naive on the post-conflict security architecture. Because they really, they talk about delaying Ukraine's NATO membership 10 years or just leave that question unanswered. If you leave that question unanswered, you're only delaying the start of the war again. The war will start again as soon as Russia has rebuilt its capability. It hasn't given up on its objectives to control all of Ukraine, or at least control enough of Ukraine to make whatever's left an unstable state with almost zero economic potential, military potential, and a massive social and political dislocation and problems. So I think increasingly the question, the most important question of the current stage of the Russia-Ukraine war is, can Ukraine survive militarily long enough for the strains of the war economically and politically to really start to have an effect in Russia. And I believe there is a time coming. Russia's been a lot more resilient than we expected economically, but many of the indicators point in a direction, only in one direction, and that is of a Russian economic degradation over the midterm and a possible economic collapse. But again, these are things that are hard to predict, and I'll say I'm not an economist, but all the indicators, recent indicators about the Russian economy are very negative. And the Russian central bank is having increasing problems sustaining the economy and maintaining the level of economic activity and GDP growth and things like that. So I think forcing Ukraine into a negotiation especially without incentivizing Russia to come to the table in good faith, and I also think leaving the post-war security architecture sort of undefined would be really significant errors.
You briefly spoke about Armenia and that part of this greater conflict too. Could you talk about or give us an update on the state of that, how that Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict plays into this larger picture as well?
Again, 30 seconds for an absolutely new topic. Go ahead.
Not entirely new.
What I would just say is that for Armenia, what has been clear is Russia's not a reliable security partner. Armenia had banked its security on sort of a Russian security guarantee, which then was not there. And Azerbaijan has taken advantage. And I think Armenia is in a very tough place presently, trying to pivot towards the West, building ties with France and the United States. Yet Turkey and Azerbaijan are squeezing Armenia. And I think there's real danger, especially with events in Georgia playing out, that could that our Armenian democracy may be in trouble, and so I think they're in need of assistance because they made a bad bet previously. But I think there's real room for Canada, for the United States, and for Europe to play an important role here.
That's an,
Sorry,
I apologize, but
okay.
I've got we're into our second round. I've got 25 minutes worth of questions to be squeezed into about 18 minutes. So we're going to be down to 4 minutes a pop. Well, we didn't. We started right on time. No, we didn't. We started right on time. So we'll go ahead. I'm happy to go 5 minutes.
Start the timer and then we'll go.
Start the timer.
So, yeah.
So you want us to do 5 minute rounds? Yeah. Okay. If you're going to do 5 minutes rounds, then we're good. You're good. What's that?
We can go 4 minutes over.
We can go 4 minutes. Okay. 5 minutes, get going. And but I'm going to be really ruthless, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question I have was related to Syria and Russia potentially losing some military sites with the fall of that regime. I wonder if you can comment first, Mr. Hamilton, on that, and then Mr. Bergman.
Sure. So Russia's two main military sites in Syria were the air base at Tamimim in Latakia province and the naval base at Tartus. Those are both very important for sort of status and prestige reasons for the Russian Federation in its own self-image as sort of a global power. And they're also important in terms of power projection in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, as far south as the Sahel in Africa. They are Russia's main power projection platforms in that part of the world. So to this point, it does not look like they're in imminent danger of losing them. I've seen assessments of an evacuation underway. I don't see anything. Yes, there are transport aircraft coming in and out. Yes, they've moved the ships from Tartus offshore a little bit, but I don't see the amount of activity that would indicate a major evacuation underway. I think the Russians, they're very good at back-channel negotiations. I'm sure they've been talking to HTS and the other opposition groups the entire time. There was a Syrian sort of caretaker prime minister from the Assad regime that stayed on. And so I think Russia believes it can preserve its access to those bases. We'll see, but I think that's the calculus in the Kremlin now.
Yes, I agree with that assessment. The one thing I'd say is I think the West has a lot of leverage here, particularly if we are going to provide, potential aid to the new Syrian government, if we're going to delist it as being a terrorist group. And the Russian influence here is simply that they have some military assets on the ground. The one other thing I would say is that this is a loss of prestige for Russia, but the maintenance of these military bases is both key for their destabilizing presence in Africa, but also for having diplomatic presence with Gulf states, with the Israelis. And the Israelis did not provide significant aid to Ukraine in the start of this war, in part because of Russia's presence. And the Gulf states have not been necessarily all that helpful when it comes to clamping down on Russia sanctions and other efforts. And they may be more accommodating should Russia be fully evicted from the region.
Chances that Russia just redeploys those naval assets back into, to strengthen its forces against Ukraine?
I don't think it can because it's a belligerent, and I think they're in the Mediterranean now. They would have to come through the Bosphorus, which means the Montreux Convention is operative. And my understanding is the Turks have been fairly scrupulous in not allowing countries that are belligerents in the war in Ukraine to enter the Bosphorus. But again, I caveat by saying I'm also not a Turkey expert.
No, that's my understanding as well.
What does if we go back to the Ukraine situation with Russia, what does that say with the U.S. commitment? If Trump does go ahead and does not provide more aid, what does that say about their commitment to the rest of Europe?
Well, I think it speaks to where the United States has been moving, and I think that where the United States has been moving is really a focus on the Indo-Pacific, and I think Donald Trump in particular has not viewed NATO as particularly important to the United States, and I think that's been a long-held position over many decades. During his first term, he ordered his Secretary of Defense to pull troops out of Germany, and so I think there's a prevailing sense that the United States wants a paradigm shift when it comes to European security, where we are less interested in providing European security than we have for the past 75 years and want to shift that responsibility to Europe. The problem is that European security is entirely dependent on the U.S. military, and removing that is like removing the backbone, and that's very hard to replace. And so I think an abrupt pullout, which I'm afraid might happen, will leave Europe very, very insecure.
In your introduction, you talked about a lack of critical thinking in this country. Can you explain to me what you mean by that and how we can address it?
I think you mean me, and I didn't mean Canada specifically, of course. I meant in Western societies in general. And I just meant that, look, Russia is extremely good. This is not your grandfather's Cold War ham-fisted Soviet propaganda that we're seeing in Western societies. This is there's a very good RAND Corporation report from 2016 called "The Fire Hose of Falsehood," and it talks about Russian misinformation, and it talks about sort of four characteristics. It's high volume, it's multi-channel, it has no commitment to consistency and no commitment to objective truth. So the idea is that Russia is not trying to get Western publics to build a positive image of Russia or to agree with the Russian position or to think that Russia's telling the truth. It's trying to undermine the idea of objective truth altogether and have Western publics believe that all governments lie all the time, and therefore what my government says is no more legitimate than what comes out of the Kremlin. And so it takes critical thinking skills to sort of disentangle what's objective truth that does still exist from what is not truth.
Okay.
And unfortunately,
we're going to have to leave this again. I am stop and apologizing. I just can't do this. We were on to the second. Madame Lalonde, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you. I would like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on Russia's reaction about the Assad regimes and its fall. But do you anticipate a repositioning of Russia? And I know my colleagues mentioning Ukraine, which I'm more interested as to see, could we see possibilities where Russia could repurpose some of their assets into the Arctic or Africa, and even maybe finding other ways within the Middle East that they could continue to have certain power, if I could say in quote?
Yes, I think what Russia will attempt, and it still remains to be seen if they're fully evicted, and I think their first step will be to try to maintain their current presence in Syria. But if they are evicted, I think we will see them try to shop around to see if they can strike a deal, perhaps with in Libya, in Tobruk, possibly Sudan. What is key is that Russia needs to have a naval port where it can support its forces in Africa and its private military contractors. And this is critical for Russia's sort of broader authoritarian support services, essentially, which it provides for many African leaders, and which is really, I think it sees as a vital geopolitical tool to potentially create instability, migration flows, other things that then could gives it some leverage vis-a-vis Europe and works to destabilize European politics.
I would just add that Sudan is I think, the most likely place. Russia and Sudan, after years of stops and starts, have finally concluded a basing agreement for a Russian naval base at Port Sudan on the Red Sea. I don't know how long it takes until that base is operative, but that would be, to me, the most obvious place for Russia to relocate if it had to out of Syria.
Thank you. You mentioned, and I really appreciated that Ukraine needs to win, and Ukraine is fighting for Canada and all NATO allies. And we heard this numerous times by a number of other countries. We did discuss the possibility of a U.S. military retraction, which in my view also would be deterrent, like a very bad decision in the leadership leading to President-elect Trump. How does a win for you is? Like, what's the win? And I believe that losing territory is not a win, but I would really like to hear your opinion on how does the win looks like.
So for me, I think it goes back 10 years. And what is this all about? And I think this is about Ukraine realizing its European future, and ultimately membership in the European Union and Europe and Ukraine being a free and liberal democratic state, part of Europe. And I think that can happen with territorial concessions. So whether Ukraine has the Donbass or Crimea, at least from my perspective as an American, is not the relevant thing. It is maintaining sovereignty, maintaining its democratic status and its European future. And I think negotiations can get there with territorial concessions. It will not be easy pill to swallow, but I think that the focus needs to be preserving Ukrainian democracy and then Ukrainian freedom to kind of choose its own future.
Yeah, I fully agree, with the caveat that no Ukrainian politician can say that out loud going into negotiations, obviously. But yes, negotiations will probably lead, there'll be some negotiating space, and will probably lead to some outcome, I think, where Russian troops remain on part of Ukraine's territory. I think a good analogy here is the Wells Declaration throughout the Cold War in the United States that never recognized the incorporation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into the Soviet Union. And that may seem sort of as a weak or diplomatic response to a military occupation, but it had legal consequences when the Soviet Union collapsed, in that it was a resumption of diplomatic relations with those three countries and not the establishment as it was with all the other Soviet republics except Russia. So some sort of analog to that in terms of Russian occupation of Ukraine, I think, is what would be advisable.
So I'm going to ask you, because it was mentioned in a public forum that I have the pleasure of participating, where the current territory that's occupied by Russia also contain a lot of critical mineral. And when I think about critical mineral and the world future, I do believe that that asset should stay within Ukraine, which is democratically elected country, as you mentioned. So leaving that territory to possibility to Russia, how can that be seen as a win for NATO's or United States of America?
Well, I think that would be, that's a very negative outcome. And I think the broader question for Ukraine is whether fighting on and continuing to fight to try to retake that territory and the potential costs that could entail is worth is worth it. And I think there is a potential case for negotiations, especially given the state of the Ukrainian military, the state of the Ukrainian economy. So I think Russia could tee that up as a win. But I think the one other thing I would say is this is where maintaining sanctions vis-a-vis Russia, maintaining our posture toward Russia as a threat is critical. So I don't necessarily wouldn't consider that a victory for Russia if it occupies that territory. It's not a good outcome for Ukraine, but we may be in a situation where not great outcomes are where Ukraine is looking at, particularly if the United States is getting weak-kneed in its support for Ukraine.
Yeah, nothing to add. I agree.
Excellent. Okay. 2.5 minutes, Mr. Simard.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. A little earlier, Mr. Hamilton, in response to a question put by one of my colleagues regarding disinformation, you said that the attempt was to do away with the very idea of objective reality. I wonder what forms that takes and what is being attacked in that effort. Are they trying to reduce confidence in institutions? Are they trying to get involved in the political debate here? Are they trying to influence specific groups of civil society? To your knowledge, what does this look like?
So I'll start with the last. Yes, the Russians are reaching out to both the far right and the far left in most Western societies. I think their ideological preferences for the far right, but they're very instrumental in how they do this. And they also reach out to far left groups. The idea is to destabilize societies, not necessarily to have most people in the society agree with sort of Russia's ideological view of how the world works. The Cold War analog to this, the Soviet Union did the same thing. Yes, most of its contacts were with the far left in Western societies, but it also reached out to far right groups and it funded far right groups. And so because the idea, again, is destabilization and the idea of causing people in the West to give up on the idea of objective truth is the objective there is to cause paralysis. Because if you give up on the idea of objective truth, you don't know who's right, who's wrong, then you're paralyzed and you can't react to what the Russians are doing. So I think that's the objective.
Est-ce qu'à votre connaissance,
to your knowledge, are there any such operations that succeed? Are we able to document the level of influence that Russians manage to have using these new communication methods? Do we have any data showing whether it works? Or whether this phenomena has only minimal effects.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a lot of good data because the thing is, this is hard. It's hard to determine exactly how many votes may have been swayed. But I would again point to the two recent examples in Moldova and Romania where we know Russian money or Russian-linked money essentially bought over 100,000 Moldovan votes in their recent election, and Russian money, Russian influence operations caused the rise of a far-right candidate from literally nothing, from polling within the margin, insignificant, statistically insignificant, to over 22% in winning the first round of the Romanian presidential election.
Madame Matheson, 2.5 minutes.
I actually wanted to give Mr. Hamilton a chance. He never had the opportunity to answer in response to the Armenian-Azerbaijan question, so I'd love to give him the opportunity to answer on that. Thank you.
Sure. The South Caucasus is one of my favorite parts of the world. I've lived in Georgia, served in the U.S. Embassy there for almost 4 years. Armenia picked the worst possible time for its turn to the West, unfortunately. And of course, they didn't pick the geopolitical conditions that surrounded their turn to the West. But if you look at Armenia's position, it's got 4 neighbors. Turkey, it has no diplomatic relations with. Azerbaijan just defeated it in war. Iran is its best bilateral relationship. Iran is a global pariah state in many ways. And then there's Georgia, which was always Armenia's window to the West. Georgia has now possibly another a case of Russian influence operations having been successful. The Georgian government is increasingly anti-Western and authoritarian. There have been hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in Tbilisi for over 2 weeks now, sustained since the Georgian government announced it was suspending its EU accession process and rejecting EU aid after it manipulated the October parliamentary elections to award itself a victory. So Armenia is in a really difficult position. And as Mr. Bergman said, it's reaching out for partners. Russia's clearly not reliable. I tell Armenians when I'm there that don't assume the West is a reliable security guarantor either, because we're not. We just don't have high enough order interests at stake to come to Armenia's aid if it's attacked again. And so it needs to diversify its partnerships. It needs to matter in a diplomatic and economic sense, have strong economic and diplomatic relationships with countries around the world. Armenia-India is another relationship that has really, really burgeoned in the last several years, including in the defense sphere. I think Armenia is now India's #1 export destination for arms. So it's a tough situation. The entire South Caucasus, Armenia in particular, it's just a really bad time for a turn to the West.
Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for attending our meeting today and helping us get informed. I want to talk a little bit about the new administration's posture. When we talk about Ukraine, and I think a lot of people also think that Trump's going to be equally tough on Putin to get to a peaceful resolution in Ukraine. But there's another calculus here is Trump has also talked very tough about Brics and their desire to replace the U.S. dollar as the global currency. So, and he's been quite aggressive in his rhetoric towards those countries about destroying their economies. So will that make him even more aggressive when dealing with Vladimir Putin on the issue of Ukraine and as it relates to the monetary policies as well?
No, it's a very, very good question, and I read with interest Trump's statements vis-a-vis the BRICS. I do not necessarily think that he will link the two that closely. I think he'll probably bifurcate, deal with Russia individually. And my concern when it comes to Russia-Ukraine is that there could be an effort to kind of negotiate over the Ukrainians' heads with Moscow, and also over the heads of Canada and our European allies as well. And I see the effort by the administration to end the war, not necessarily to end the war on the best terms for Ukraine. When it comes to the BRICS and the international monetary system, it's a very good question about the dollar as the kind of the central reserve currency. I think in many respects, there's been conflicting information here. On the one hand, we see Russia and China actively working to create kind of an alternative system, and Russia's economic resilience thus far, I think, points to that an ability to perhaps be somewhat diversified away from the dollar. On the other hand, when there's an economic crisis, everyone wants to flock to the dollar, and the dollar remains incredibly strong. So it still is the kind of central reserve currency that gives the United States great leverage. People want to be part of the U.S. financial system. And so I don't really see Brazil and India going in siding with China and Russia, perhaps in that direction. But it is something that I think many experts in the global financial system are really watching out for to see how that progresses over the next few years.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Trump administration will sort of divide or bifurcate its responses to BRICS and de-dollarization in Ukraine. BRICS is about economic issues, which I think will lead in a Trump administration. They will lead with the economic instrument. Ukraine, I think we shouldn't forget, Trump got impeached over Ukraine. Ukraine's personal for him. So I think, will set that in a separate bin.
I appreciate that. I just thought that with his tough rhetoric, that he might carry that through on Ukraine as well. And I was hoping that the meetings that he's had with Zelensky would strengthen Ukraine's hand in the potential negotiations on bringing about the end to the war. Just want to talk about Syria again, the fall of the Assad regime. We talk about the Tarsk port that the Russian Navy has been using. In Turkey's interest in Syria and collapsing the regime, will you think that they would be opposed to Russia continuing any operations in Syria?
Well, I think Turkey would most likely want the Russian bases to be removed because they were on opposite sides of the conflict. That said, Turkey and Russia had, I guess, there's in some ways sort of quote unquote frenemies where they have established really strong and solid working relationships at the same time while they clash in many ways over kind of their historic geographic situation. So I would see Turkey. I think Turkey could be a useful country in pushing for the expulsion of Russian bases, but we'll see what the Erdogan-Putin, if there is correspondence there, we may not know, but I think that may be one of Putin's first calls in response to the collapse of Assad.
I am very surprised that we haven't seen, the Russian fleet, sail through the Mediterranean up to the Baltics and go back to St. Petersburg, and that we haven't seen all the aircraft that are stationed in Syria, that Russia hasn't taken them home. So I guess the long-term impact of Russia's brutal mercenary operations, originally by Wagner in Africa, will be greatly undermined as well, will it not?
That would be a question there.
Yeah, that would be my presumption.
Okay. Mr. Pawlowski.
You've both talked about collaboration between Russia and China. Well, we've also started to talk about Brics, and I wonder how we should be dealing with Brics. How much is Brics, because obviously Russia and China are a big part of Brics. How much do you think that Brics in itself is contributing to undermining the international legal order, given the central place of Russia and China in that organization? What should be our response to Brics? And certainly the Brics, I think, is trying to cater to a lot of lower and middle income countries to become part of Brics, to be part of this global alliance against the West. And certainly I think they've been trying to win favor, for example, in Africa. Are we doing enough to kind of try to counter that and win favor and get some more allegiances from countries, particularly in Africa?
My short answer would be no. I don't think we are doing enough. And I think part of what the formation and expansion of Brics highlights is that there has not been enough effort to, I think, really engage the quote-unquote global South or other countries as part of kind of the global international architecture, as we would call it. So we saw the Biden administration really double down on the G7. G7 is an incredibly important format, but not really create something that was inclusive of many of our democratic partners or countries that we want to engage more with in the developing world or global South, whatever name you want to use. And that's in particular Brazil, India, South Africa, but as well as other countries like Senegal. And I think that is sort of a blind spot, and that's where China and Russia have sort of seized the initiative to try to rebalance the global international architecture and expand Brics. And so it's a diverse group, but I think it's something that we need to be very mindful of going forward, because it's an alternative way of setting norms, setting rules of the road for the international system.
Agreed. And I would only add two short things. First of all, the more Brics expands, it now, as of this year, it includes Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE, the harder it will be to gain consensus. And then the second thing is, among China and Russia, the two largest countries in BRICS, I think there's a fundamental difference of what the purpose of the organization is. Russia is trying to turn it explicitly into an anti-Western organization. China and many of the other founding members, I think, are not on board with that vision. And so there's some daylight between their positions there.
Thank you, Mr. Pawlowski. We still have a couple of minutes left, and so I'll finish off. Our most famous political hockey-playing philosopher is a guy named Wayne Gretzky, and he's famous for saying you go to where the puck is going rather than where the puck is. And so I'd be interested in both your thoughts on where the puck is going with respect to the Kurdish involvement in Syria, particularly if there's going to be a drawdown of American resources there. Secondly, what Erdogan might be expected to do, particularly with the administration. Thirdly, the administration in Syria. Thirdly, you've spoken about the Russians extensively, so I think you've answered that. But fourthly, I think the big unknown here is Israel, as to what Israel it could be anticipated to do. So on 3 out of those 4, where is the puck going in the short term? In 25 words or less.
On Turkey, Turkey's biggest concern, I think, is the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the U.S.-backed organization, political military organization that controls essentially a third of Syria. Everything north and east of the Euphrates is under the control of the SDF, de facto. Turkey has already been attacking SDF units since the HTS takeover, since the sort of the unfreezing of the military situation there. So I think it remains to be seen. I think the U.S. is there with the SDF legally to destroy and then prevent the reemergence of ISIS. There's going to have to be some serious, I guess, behind-the-scenes discussions between U.S. and Turkey about what the future of eastern Syria is, because right now it's not under the control of anybody in Damascus. It's under local control of the SDF. In terms of Israel, they've already mounted sort of a limited incursion into Syria. I was in Israel in 2018, and we were standing on the Golan Heights, and the Israeli army officer with us said, look, we are more comfortable with, at the time, a Sunni opposition group was in control of, this was in Dara province, that part of Syria. He said, we're more comfortable with them than the Assad regime across our border, because where the Assad regime comes, the Iranians come with. So I think Israel is probably happy about the fall of the Assad regime and the collapse of Iranian influence in Syria, but is watching very closely to see what happens across the border. I think I'll leave it there, because the other two I don't have a lot of expertise in.
I mean, I think I'll just stay quickly on Israel, that Israel has tremendous military tools, and what in some ways has now put the Middle East in a place where it needs more political tools, where the situation in Lebanon, for instance, where you would hope to see the Lebanese armed forces be able to assert more control and vis-a-vis Hezbollah and an actual state-building process occur there. Similarly in Syria. And then that brings to Iran, which where does Iran go from here? And right now they're very much down. And so I think there is real concern that Iran may see its weakness as necessitating a move toward a nuclear weapon, or this necessitates a potential opening for renewed talks with a Trump administration. I don't know if there'll be that appetite on the Trump administration's part. I think there is probably an opening where the Iranians are weak and would be willing to talk. And we'll see where Israel goes from there, because Israel will have a lot of influence, I think, over the course of direction of the Middle East and of U.S. policy as well toward Iran and the region.
Well, thank you both for your very thoughtful responses. This has been a rich discussion, and I know colleagues appreciate it. And thank you for making yourselves available. With that, meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.